when you look at what a cyber attack can do to the valuation of an asset or the valuation of a company, it's pretty significant. And so definitely shareholders and investors need to know what the risks are and what a company is doing to mitigate that risk.
Joining me today is Lucian Niemeyer, CEO of the nonprofit Building Cybersecurity. Lucian, thanks so much for joining us.
Matt, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to start. Can you tell us how companies can ensure that their data and operations are secure?
Yeah, it starts with understanding what their risk is. Every company has a different set of priorities as far as what's their existential risk to their brand, to their employees, to their operations. So it starts with, okay, what can happen to us that will cause us the most harm? And then ranking and prioritizing, okay, what are we doing to respond to that? So for instance, if you're a data-driven company within a REIT, okay, you obviously have to pay attention to your software. But if you're running a portfolio that has values to each of those facilities or buildings, you also have to look at what other risks out there that could potentially devalue that portfolio. So really it's understanding risk from a very comprehensive perspective that covers data, information technology systems, and then the smart operational technology systems that are running your buildings. We want smart tech in our buildings. It makes our buildings more effective, more efficient, better user experience, but also creates a risk. So I'd recommend the first thing to do is look at where do you have the most exposure and then what you can do to mitigate that risk.
And how can company management teams and boards best avoid heavy costs associated with ransom, business loss reduction in real estate values, reputational damage, and even potentially personal liability?
Okay. First of all, as far as corporate boards, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. The cyber threats is proliferating, and it could be a small ransomware attack or it could be something more serious. But the big issue here is you have to have C-suite involvement from the very top. We've had years of chief information officers and CISOs, chief information security officers, that are been trying to put the word out, here's what you need to do to protect yourself. But when a company realizes that its valuation is on the line, its corporate identity, its brand is on the line, when the CEO makes those determinations, then you get a little more emphasis on what could be done to mitigate risk. As far as what the CEO needs to ask, start implementing the programs that are easy. Cyber hygiene, just doing simple things, making sure every employee does that. You can cut down a lot of the risk at the corporate level just by a little more diligence and really putting to work some of the initiatives and some of the checklists that are out there to just reduce that top line risk, that 75% of risk.
And what are your thoughts on the SEC's proposed rules which call for enhanced required disclosure of cybersecurity incidents in corporate filings, as well as registrants' risk management and strategy, and governance around oversight of cybersecurity risk, as well as the board's oversight and expertise?
So first of all, the SEC is doing the right thing. When you look at what a cyber attack can do to the valuation of an asset or the valuation of a company, it's pretty significant. And so definitely shareholders and investors need to know what the risks are and what a company is doing to mitigate that risk. So I commend the SEC for even proposing that. There's some mandatory reporting requirements that are included in that rule, which may be problematic. It's really difficult to tell a company you have to report when you've had some type of cyber attack. A lot of companies just want to pay the ransom or recover without necessarily needing to let their shareholders know or their investors know. So I think that part probably is going to see some changes. The other sections that require improved governance, improved filings of what is being done, all good. I think investors and shareholders need to know that. So I would say overall, positive movement. Question becomes, how do you audit it? What's the material and aspects of it? What do you need to score, or what do you need to ultimately provide the SEC? That's still to be worked out, and then unfortunately, that's where the devil's in the details, where how effective it is. You don't want to be chasing an audit or a compliance requirement as opposed to doing what you need to do to mitigate risk. So from that perspective, it really needs to be implemented in a way that will incentivize companies to mitigate risk as opposed to transferring it.
And you mentioned that cyber risk, like other corporate risk, is either assumed, mitigated, or transferred. How effective is cyber insurance?
Yeah, so that's been the primary method for reducing risk exposure is buying a cyber insurance policy. And what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is a hardening of that market. as cyber attacks proliferate and claims go up, it's harder to get good coverage. Premiums are going up, deductibles are going up, you have exclusion clauses are expanding. So it's getting to the point where a CEO or a CFO or a chief risk officer needs to make a call. Is it worth spending money on a cyber insurance policy, or should we be spending the money on mitigating that risk? Now, I'm squarely in the camp coming into Nareit and talking to the team here that we need to mitigate that risk. We need to spend money on how do you reduce risks in your portfolio that are effective investments, and then realizing, okay, what do I have left for exposure? Now let's talk to our underwriters and our carriers, and where can we address that gap? But we need to marry the two, investments in mitigation, and then also then realizing what do we have left that we can transfer risk.
And finally, as someone who focuses on this issue day in, day out, what keeps you up at night when it comes to cyber risk?
So my background, I'm coming out of the federal government where at one point I was an Assistant Secretary of Defense for all of installations in real estate for the entire world. And so what kept me up at night was a cyber attack was going to take down my asset. And it would cause a national security concern. So I'm taking that passion and saying, look, this can happen in our society. It can happen in our homes. It can happen in our cars. And it can happen in our buildings. And it can happen in our portfolios. So what keeps me up at night is we're not paying as much attention to what can happen in the building that can hurt somebody or cause property damage. In the sessions I've been listening to here during REITwise, it's been mainly about the IT side of the house, the information technology. Where is data potentially being exploited, or where are business systems? I'm concerned about the operational technologies, the things that you and I rely on for survival, that they are vulnerable. And we, as an organization here, and with real estate writ large around the world, need to see that there's a growing risk to occupants that we need to address. So that's what's keeping me up at night, is raising awareness on where we have a different type of cyber risk that can directly affect you and I in our homes, in our cars, in our buildings, and that's what we need to be looking for to mitigate that risk.